One of the reasons I'm voting for that the Iran or the diplomacy is going nowhere is something that our ally Israel had mentioned a few weeks back. And incidentally, I was at the first debate, and no one mentioned Israel at all, and they're the country that have the most to lose, and they're our friends. My question is, when Prime Minister Netanyahu said the other day in a very undiplomatic way that if the United States doesn't take care of this, we are. Now, I thought that was shocking. That indicated that they think our diplomacy is sort of 1938 vintage with an umbrella and a V sign, and it's going nowhere. So, if Mr. Netanyahu were here tonight, how would you assure him that he can maintain his confidence in the United States?
Thank you. Nick Burns.
I'm glad you raised the issue, because we do have to talk about Israel here. I think one of the basic problems that the United States should have with Iran is the threats that Ahmadinejad has made against the Israeli state and the existence of the Israeli people. And it should be a vital national priority, and it is, for the United States to safeguard Israel and protect it. And that's one of our key strategic interests here. How do we best do that? I fear that if the Israelis launched airstrikes, or if we did in the next couple of months, we wouldn't have ever tested the proposition that maybe diplomacy and sanctions, backed up by the use of force, could work. And we get ourselves into a position where we'd have the unintended consequences of war. We found out about that in Iraq. We have the ability of Iran to use Hezbollah and Hamas asymmetrically to attack Israel, to attack the moderate Palestinians and American interests. And I'm not aware of a convincing scenario where the use of force actually works. And so I would just say very respectfully to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he has a right to raise this issue, he should raise this issue, that the United States should make a commitment to Israel, that we will safeguard its security. They should allow President Obama, in my judgment, working very closely with Israel, to take the lead for as long as we think that this diplomatic path can be successful. There may become a time when we want to end diplomacy and go to a tougher option.
Dan Senor.
I put Prime Minister Netanyahu in the same category that I put all of the regional players, or at least many of them, which they are deeply concerned about the mixed signals they're getting from this administration. Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying what he's saying because he is concerned that the administration is not backing up their diplomatic plan with a credible military threat to solve this problem if it doesn't go anywhere. That is the same thing that is going on throughout the Persian Gulf and the Arab world. And I take your earlier point, Ken, that it's very difficult to sort of read exactly what is going on in each one of these Arab societies. But just the fact that Secretary Gates, as Liz said earlier, had to travel to Cairo and Riyadh to reassure them, don't worry, we're not going to make this open-ended. And the fact that Dennis Ross has had to bounce around all these capitals to say, don't misread, we're trying to talk, but it's not going to. I mean, it gets to a point here where these people are voting, and whether it's Netanyahu or the King of Jordan or the King of Saudi Arabia or the President of Egypt, there is deep concern in the region. And this is a profoundly violent and volatile neighborhood we're talking about, where wars often start because of misunderstandings and miscommunications and mixed signals and violent revolutions. And we are dealing with a region right now which I believe, because of the current administration's lack of clarity about how they intend to back up this diplomatic process, if the Iranians actually ever enter into it, is potential for a very dangerous situation.
Sir, your question?
For clarification on what you mean, the arguers against the motion suggest that speaking with Russia and China would be part of diplomacy, whereas the arguers for the motion, I don't think they're thinking of that kind of diplomacy. As I understand the question, is whether we should negotiate or seek diplomacy with Iran, or just tell Iran to get lost, but that still reserves the opportunity to talk with Russia and China and try to agree on a sanction. So I'd like you each to define what you mean by diplomacy. If you're talking with China and Russia, who do you vote for in this debate?
I think we actually probably all four agree that successful diplomacy cannot be bilateral. Now, I probably shouldn't speak for my opponents here, but successful diplomacy has got to include countries like Russia and China, who actually have relationships with Iran that they could use. They've got leverage with Iran that they could use were they to choose to use it. I think the difference between us, there are two differences between us. One is, I would say, all right, let's accept for the sake of argument that we can work with Russia and China to try to put tough sanctions in place against the Iranians. There's no evidence right now that there's any intent on the part of either Russia or China to put tough sanctions in place against the Iranians. That piece of this diplomacy is going nowhere. And I think the second difference is, this question of how much hope do you hold out after years and years and years? And, Lavrov said to us, within the last 6 weeks, I don't want to have tougher sanctions on the Iranians. I mean, we ran into this problem consistently. At the end of the day, the only thing that will get the Russians and the Chinese and some of the Europeans on board with this is if they believe if they don't sign up for crippling sanctions, the United States will use force. And right now, they don't believe that.
Ken Pollack.
You may have all noticed we're kind of competitive people, all of us up here on this panel. We're actually all friends, too. Please don't let the competitiveness drown that out. And I want to ask this question not to score debating points, because I think that there is something really interesting going on here, and I've just been kind of reflecting on it, and this question really kind of brought it to the fore for me, and it goes back to the question I raised before, but I want to put it in a neutral fashion. I don't want it to be a debating point. But I do want to ask this question because, although I am the only Democrat on the panel, I am not speaking for the Obama administration, and as Dan and Liz know, I am very glad to disagree with my own party very publicly whenever I think it's necessary. But the question I would like to ask is, what is it that you feel we're not doing that we should be doing that would make, because again, I think I'd probably sign up for it, and I want to hear it.
Dan, I can give you 20 seconds
20
to answer
seconds,
that
okay,
question.
I'll be real quick, but I do want to commend Ken for taking on his own party from time to time, which he's done on some pretty big issues. So
That was a waste of 4 seconds.
Second, I know. With the balance of my 16, I will say, if you believe there is a discussion going on right now within the Iranian government between confrontationalists, those who believe that we just need to plow it, or the Iranians need to plow ahead and build their nuclear bomb and be quite confrontational, and those that are reformers that believe that we can cut a deal, the Iranians can cut a deal with the West, we clearly want to strengthen their hand. And what better way to strengthen their hand that when they're going into those discussions with the hardliners than to say, if we don't act now, while employment is 25 to 30%, while our economy is falling apart, 70% of the population is under 30 years old, we could have a revolt here. If the Americans move forward with truly crippling economic sanctions or potentially military force, this regime will collapse and we will have a total mess on our hands. That is the kind of leverage we want to give the reformers in their internal debates with the hardliners. To say, the Americans left this thing open-ended. They're having a discussion. We haven't even returned their phone calls yet. This is great. The hardliners aren't going to be terribly persuaded that they should be responsive.
That concludes round 2 of our debate.